The peasants knelt as if before a walking cathedral of steel. 100 tons of ceramite, pistons, and annihilation. They whispered titles for him: Protector, Savior, even God. But inside the command cradle, Baron Terran could sense what lay beneath their praise. It wasn't devotion. It was fear. And when famine arrived, that fear would reveal what the Imperium truly prized. Certainly not the lives of common folk. Duty speaks softly until it claws its way into a shout. That is what I remember most. Faces, hundreds of them, long before the rituals, before the accolades of my lineage, even before the searing moment I first linked minds with my knight. Those faces of Aurelia haunted me. What I mistook for reverence in their eyes, I later recognized as dread. When the mighty footfalls of my Questoris knight-errant, righteous dominion, thundered across their fields, they scattered like animals before an unpredictable storm. Not as grateful subjects, but as mortals afraid of an unrestrained god. My bloodline insisted this was how the universe worked. For millennia, House Terran had stood as the bulwark against everything that stalked humanity, and for just as long, we demanded our price. I recall my first communion with the throne mechanicum as if the memory were still fresh. The sacristans tended the machine through the night, anointing its joints, whispering binary prayers, calming the ancient spirit that dwelled within its armored shell. Even though I was only the 9th son, groomed but never meant to rule, I had trained relentlessly. 7 brothers already bore their own knights. Lucius, the eldest, remained at father's side, heir to everything. Walking into the sanctum that day, I felt every ancestor watching from the shadows of Castellan Terran, our austere mountain keep above the golden grain fields. Though modest compared to the opulence of our primary holdings on Valoris, to the peasants it was a fortress of legends, its adamantine spires stabbing toward the sky, its foundations sunk deep into the earth like iron roots. And at the heart of it awaited the throne mechanicum, glowing crimson, tendrils of mechadendrites shifting like predatory serpents. The metal was icy against my skin when I sat. The neural jack slid into the port at my neck. Then came the flood. 10,000 years of memories crashing through my mind. The bond between knight and pilot is not simply wires and impulses. It is the weight of every soul who sat there before you. I felt my great-grandfather crushing a peasant uprising, his thermal cannon melting bodies as he gloried in the slaughter. I felt Cousin Table cleaving through Xenos raiders, only to be met with terror instead of gratitude from those he saved. And beneath all of them, a deeper presence watched, righteous dominion itself. Ancient, proud, judging, it searched for cracks in my resolve, for doubt, for anything less than absolute certainty in the nobility of our bloodline. When the communion ended, I was still myself, mostly. The sacristans proclaimed the bond strong. Father laid a gauntleted hand on my shoulder. My brothers looked at me with a mix of pride and rivalry. Only Lucius seemed uneasy. That night I dreamed of walking the fields, but through the knight's eyes. Each step churned the fertile soil. The peasants didn't approach in orderly tribute. They fled in pure terror. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, dismissing it as a side effect of the bonding. But the dreams returned again and again, voices crying out, prayers whispered not to me, but begging the Emperor to deliver them from us. I told no one. To confess such visions was to invite accusations of instability, and unstable pilots were stripped of their titles and locked away forever. So I immersed myself in duty, slaying orcs along the borders, standing sentinel at harvest festivals, receiving tribute of grain, ore, and labor. For a time, the nightmares faded. I convinced myself the throne mechanicum was simply rewriting parts of my mind, as all knight thrones did. I was Baron Gas Terran, 9th son of Alcides, pilot of righteous dominion, servant of the Omnissiah. My path was clear. Then came the blight. It began subtly in the eastern fields, patches of sickly grain that spread faster than fire. The agriculturalists burned swaths of land, sprayed Mechanicus treatments, imported off-world strains. Nothing slowed it. Within a month, half our crops were gone. Within 2, the situation was catastrophic. Father called a council. Only Lucius, Marius, and I were on Viralia. The rest of our brothers were away on campaigns. Even Father looked diminished under the weight of impending disaster. The hololith he activated painted the truth in stark red. Nearly all arable land dying. Lucius spoke first. We must reduce the population. The harvest can support only a third. The rest are surplus. His cold logic twisted my stomach, not because it was unfamiliar, but because the dreams surged back. Fearful faces, desperate prayers, the terror of those who were supposed to trust us. Yet I offered no alternative. Starvation would kill them anyway. A controlled culling was, by Imperial standards, merciful. Marius proposed aid from Valoris, but we all knew it would never arrive in time. Imperial logistics did not bend for hungry peasants. In the end, we settled on rationing, strict, merciless, unyielding. The skilled would live. The rest would endure barely enough to cling to life. I accepted the decision with quiet dread. But we underestimated how the people would react. For generations they toiled, tithed, and offered their children to Imperial Guard levies. In return, we protected them. But now we couldn't even shield them from hunger. Something inside them broke. The first riot ignited in Harrow's Mill. Enforcers were overwhelmed. Grain stores ransacked. The rationing plan shattered in a single night. By dawn, a breathless messenger delivered the news. Father's response was immediate. "Gas," he commanded. "Take righteous dominion to Harrow's Mill. Punish the ringleaders. Make certain there will not be a second riot." I agreed, though an icy dread settled into my bones. The dreams from the night before had been worse than ever. Visions of me firing into crowds, the machine spirit exulting in the deaths. In the sanctum, righteous dominion awaited. Power cables like umbilicals, its armored frame trembling with restrained fury. The neural connection snapped into place. This time I felt not only its ancient pride, but something darker. Anticipation. Hunger. It knew we marched against our own people, and welcomed it. The doors opened onto a grey dawn. The knight stepped forward, each stride shaking the mountain. Hours passed as we descended toward Harrow's Mill. I told myself I would be merciful. Kill only the instigators. Spare the rest. A thermal blast is quick. Clean. That was the thin lie I clung to. The settlement appeared in the distance, a scatter of habs and processing plants in a shallow valley. Smoke drifted upward from the previous night's chaos. I expected to find the people hiding, trembling at the judgment approaching them. But when I arrived, they were waiting. Hundreds of them, armed with tools, knives, makeshift weapons. They were done kneeling. The connection struck like a hammer of light. Not the gradual merging I had known before, not the steady layering of thoughts and impressions. This time, the throne mechanicum seized my consciousness with a violence that took my breath away. For an instant, I felt as though my skull might crack from the pressure of it. And then came the screams. Not my own. Not the machine spirits. Theirs. The voices of Harrow's Mill flooded into me with unbearable clarity, ragged pleas, fading breaths, whispered prayers that had once felt distant, like echoes trapped in a dream. Now they roared through my veins as though they were carried by my blood itself. They filled every corner of my mind, an army of ghosts pressing in around me, demanding to be acknowledged. For a heartbeat, I could not tell where I ended and they began. The machine spirit bristled at their presence. Its fury lashed outward like an enraged beast in a cage, offended that such lesser lives would dare intrude upon the sacred communion between knight and pilot. I felt its indignation rising, simmering into hatred, and that hatred merged with the memories of my ancestors like molten metal poured into a mold. Kill them, silence them, reassert dominance. This is the way. This has always been the way. The throne mechanicum pulsed with the doctrine of millennia, and for a moment my hands moved without conscious thought, initiating battle protocols, powering weapon systems, preparing for slaughter that did not yet exist. But then another voice rose above the rest, soft, tired, unmistakably human. "Let us eat." The chant from Harrow's mill. Not in anger now, in mourning. The machine spirit recoiled violently, recoiling as though the phrase were a corruption, a heresy. The neural link jolted with enough force to make my vision blur. Warning sigils cascaded across my visual display as the night registered the internal conflict between flesh and spirit. I gasped for air. I tasted iron. The sacristans must have seen the tremors. I heard their muffled shouts outside the sealed carapace, their panicked prayers as they tried to stabilize the connection. But their words were meaningless, thin scratches against the immensity of the voices in my head. The machine spirit pushed harder. Obey tradition. Obey your lineage. Obey your duty. But the ghosts answered it. Not with accusation, not with rage, but with something far heavier. Disappointment. Not in House Terran, not in the Imperium, but in me. For the first time since childhood, I felt something inside me fracture. Pain lanced through my temples. Warning glyphs flared crimson. The night's reactor thrummed dangerously, as though responding to the conflict in my mind. I could feel its weapons cycling, power conduits igniting, auspex arrays locking onto phantom threats. If I didn't regain control, righteous dominion would enter combat mode on its own. Against what? Anything. Everything. The sacristans hammered on the exterior plating now. Frantic. I sensed their fear through the shallow auxiliary connections. Fear not for me, but for the potential rampage of a knight whose pilot was losing control. I forced myself to breathe. Slow. Even. I reached out. Not to the machine spirit, but beyond it. To the voices, to the memories I wished I didn't carry. To Harrow's mill. Enough, I whispered into the void of my own mind. The spirits did not fade, but they quieted. Their cries softened into a low hum like embers cooling after a fire. I felt no forgiveness from them, only acknowledgement. A hollow kind of acceptance. The machine spirit, however, simmered with palpable resentment. I had denied it. I had resisted. And knights do not forget defiance. When my eyes refocused through the visual overlays, I realized I was shaking. My hands were clamped so tightly around the command grips that blood seeped from between my fingers. My breath came in ragged shudders, and through it all, the auspex alert pulsed steadily. A reminder of the orc incursion that awaited me in the forests. Duty, always duty. With effort that bordered on agony, I pushed the knight forward. The sanctum doors rumbled open and the cold air of Aurelia swept into the docking chamber. But I did not feel the chill. The voices walked with me. And for the first time since I became a knight, the machine spirit did not feel like an ally. It felt like a rival, a predator circling inside my skull. Waiting for the moment I faltered again, the moment the communion began. It struck me like a hammer. The machine spirit of righteous dominion didn't seep into my mind as it usually did. It crashed in, a tidal wave of iron will and blazing purpose. It felt eager, almost impatient, as if it had been waiting for this moment, straining at the edge of our severed link. And it did not come alone. The voices came with it. They were no longer faint echoes at the edge of thought. They were immediate, deafening, as if every soul from Harrow's mill had been etched into the night's very circuitry and now poured straight into my skull. My body shuddered violently in the throne. I tried to speak, to order the sacristans to disconnect me, but my jaw was locked. My muscles were no longer entirely my own. Righteous dominion held me in place, clutching my nervous system like a fist. It wanted my attention. It wanted me to see. Vision shattered into overlapping images. I saw the knight marching over Verelia's fields, but my perception had split in two. From one angle, I looked through the night's sensors, rangefinders, targeting reticles, tactical overlays, painting the world in cold strategic clarity. From the other, I looked up from the ground, through ordinary human eyes. I felt the awe. I felt the fear. I felt the hopelessness of being so small beneath something so vast and uncaring. Then the realization came. The throne mechanicum did not just hold the memories of its pilots. It remembered everything, every scream cut short by a thermal blast, every plea whispered in the shadow of its armored form, every tremor of terror in those who beheld it. All of it, recorded, stored, catalogued in data crypts older than our house. And more terrible still, I finally understood the true nature of the bond. We had always been told it was about lineage, compatibility, training, but that was only the surface. The night did not bond with us out of reverence for our bloodline. It needed us. It fed on our capacity to hurt, on our readiness to unleash destruction, on our willingness to justify atrocities as duty. The truth hit me like lightning. House Terran's knights were not noble heroes guarding humanity. We were symbiotic predators. The night gave us power. In return, we provided it a steady harvest of suffering. I tried to reject the thought as madness, as some warp-touched delusion, but the proof surrounded me, encoded in the night's own systems. The machine spirit was always most responsive after a slaughter. It grew eager when battle loomed. It did not care if its victims were orcs or humans. Death was death, and death pleased it. My ancestors had known this, at least in part. I could feel it in the resonance of their memories. Moments of unease buried under dogma. Flashes of doubt smothered by oaths to honor, duty, house. They had seen the same truth I was seeing and had chosen to bow before it. I did not know how long I remained trapped in that loop of revelation and denial. Eventually, the pressure eased. The night loosened its grip, withdrawing just enough to let me think again. It had shown me what it wanted me to know, and it was certain I would never speak of it. When I finally disconnected, my legs nearly buckled. The sacristans hurried to my side, reporting wildly fluctuating vitals, an overlong communion, the risk of neural scarring. They feared I might no longer be fit to pilot. I lied. I said I was fine. In reality, everything I believed in lay in ruins, but I could not confide in them. They were servants of the Omnissiah, bound in loyalty to the machine spirits. To them, what I had seen would not be a horror. It would be confirmation of sacred truth. At best, they would declare me unstable. At worst, a heretic. And still, the orcs needed to be dealt with. So I pushed the horror down, locked it away beside the whispers of Harrow's mill, and walked back to the waiting night. This time, I could feel the machine spirit's anticipation like a physical weight. It knew violence was coming. It wanted it. It hungered for it. But now, I noticed something else as well. A flaw. A tiny imperfection where my mind met the night's systems. A hairline crack in the interface that I must have sensed before, but never understood. Now I clung to it like a lifeline. I couldn't break the bond entirely, but perhaps I could carve out a sliver of myself that remained my own. The orcs were easy to locate. A war band of maybe 100 green-skinned brutes, bristling with crude blades and scavenged firearms. They'd already raided a remote farmstead, murdered the family, stolen their food, and were marching deeper into our lands in search of more. Normally, this would have been no challenge at all. One salvo from the thermal cannon could have annihilated them before they knew they were under attack. Clean, efficient, glorious by knightly standards. The machine spirit urged me in that direction. It wanted the cannon. It wanted another Harrow's mill, scaled down, but just as satisfying. I refused. Instead of charging the thermal cannon, I activated the Reaper chain blade. The enormous weapon roared to life, teeth spinning in a shrieking blur of adamantium. It would still kill the orcs, but one at a time, in brutal, physical melee. No grand obliteration, no instant erasure of dozens of lives. No feast. The knight's displeasure hit me like a spike between the eyes. Pain lanced through the link, sharp and escalating, as the throne mechanicum tried to override my decision. Systems flickered as it attempted to seize command authority, but I dug my mental fingers into that crack in the interface, that tiny fault line, and held on with everything I had. The fight that followed was ugly. I drove righteous dominion straight into the warband, chainblade carving through bodies in grisly arcs. Orcs swarmed the knight, some clambering up its legs, hacking at armor plating with industrial cutters and explosive tools. Their weapons left only scratches and shallow dents, but each impact translated into a flash of pain along my nerves, the knight's way of reminding me that its body and mine were one. Still, I refused to fire the thermal cannon. Slash by slash, stomp by stomp, I cut them down the hard way. By the time the last orc fell, green blood and ichor steaming on the shattered ground, my body was shaking. Sweat ran into my eyes. My muscles trembled, not from physical exertion alone, but from the strain of holding my will apart from the machine spirit's demands. We returned to Castellan Terran in victory, but the word rang hollow. The whispers in my head, the dead of Harrow's Mill, were still with me. But now they sat alongside something else. Understanding. I could no longer pretend ignorance. We were not paragons of chivalry. We were partners in a quiet, terrible bargain. Knights drank deeply of death, and in return, their pilots were granted power and status beyond the dreams of common folk. The revelation left me emptied out, as if someone had carved my purpose out with a knife. Then came the news that changed everything. Lucius was dead. They called it a hunting accident, his grav chute malfunctioning during a chase of Virelia's airborne predators. The report was vague, the details conveniently sparse, but the conclusion was obvious enough. With Marius off-world and the others scattered across distant campaigns, I was now the senior son on Virelia. Father summoned me that evening. He looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of grief and responsibility had compacted him, yet his voice remained iron. The line of succession had to be maintained. I would take Lucius's role at once. When his time ended, I would inherit Virelia. I should have been elated. As the ninth son, I had never expected such elevation. Instead, dread sank its claws into me. To become Baron meant more knights, deeper communion, closer intimacy with the very forces I now knew to be corrupt. It meant embracing the relationship I was trying to resist. But I said none of this. I bowed, I accepted, and I made myself a quiet promise. If I could not destroy the system, perhaps I could bend it. Perhaps I could shift House Terran's rule by even a fraction, make it less predatory, less cruel. It was a fragile hope. But in those days, it was the only thing that kept me from breaking. As heir designate, I gained access to archives previously denied to me. I studied our true history, our dealings with the Mechanicus, the ancient oaths that bound us to the knights, the subtle ways machine spirits had shaped our traditions over thousands of years. I also discovered something else. Records of those rare pilots who had resisted. They were never celebrated. Most were footnotes, names attached to incidents politely described as instabilities, partial communion failures, or non-standard responses to throne integration. Some had refused orders. Some had avoided combat whenever possible. A few had tried to sever their bonds entirely. None had truly won, but some had carved out slivers of autonomy, enough to remain partially themselves within the machine. They were tolerated, barely shunted into less critical roles, assigned to defensive patrols or ceremonial duties. I began to fashion myself in their image. Each time I entered the throne, I held a piece of myself apart. I focused on that tiny flaw in the interface and widened it bit by bit, turning it into a mental redoubt where the machine spirit could not follow. The sacristans noticed something was off. Their diagnostics showed irregular neural alignment, incomplete synchronization with righteous dominion. But they could find no mechanical failure to blame, and in battle I remained effective. So they watched, whispering, and waited. Outside the sanctum, Viralia continued to wither. The blight consumed almost every field. Rations kept the population alive, but only just. Even skilled workers and essential personnel lived with constant hunger gnawing at their bellies, and above it all loomed the looming deadline of the tithe. Soon, Imperial ships would arrive expecting grain and recruits we no longer had. Father strained under the burden. He spent sleepless nights with Mechanicus adepts, pursuing impossible cures. He sent desperate pleas to Valoris, begging for aid through overtaxed shipping lanes. He even considered appealing to rival noble houses, offering concessions, alliances, anything that might save Viralia. Nothing worked. The planet itself seemed to reject us. The soil would not yield. The crops would not grow. And through it all, the whispers did not cease. Harrow's mill was no longer alone. Other voices joined them, victims of raids, accidents, starvation. Not vengeful, not roaring for blood, just pleading to be remembered, to be acknowledged, to matter. I stopped trying to shut them out. I began to listen. In their simple words, in their fear and exhaustion and quiet hopes, I found a clarity that had eluded House Terran for 10,000 years. The people did not need gods in steel. They did not need lords who towered over them. They needed someone who saw them as more than assets, more than labor, more than a number on a ration slate. So I started to act. I revised the rationing schedules, narrowing the gap between essential and non-essential citizens. I ordered the house guards to curb their casual brutality, to treat the people as subjects rather than livestock. I began touring the remaining settlements, not in righteous dominion, but in a simple ground vehicle, walking among the people, speaking with them face to face. It was a small rebellion, barely noticeable against the colossus of the Imperium. But within House Terran, it was practically heresy. My father watched me with growing concern. The house officers were less subtle. They saw leniency where I saw justice, softness where I saw humanity. They muttered about weakness in the line of succession, about the danger of a baron who listened too closely to the cries of the starving. They had no idea that I also listened to the dead, and that the dead were the only reason I had not yet gone mad.